All right. All right, so let's get started so that I can get through this quickly and then you guys can get back to working on your individual stuff. So anyway, so one of the things we wanted to emphasize is also how, so in this one, I'm going to talk a little bit about informality, which you witnessed. So just clarify what that is, and then um, also show how. So most of the challenges in regard to resilience, sustainability, poverty alleviation, development. I mean, they tend to sort of be concentrated spatially in the poorer or more marginalized areas of the city, right? So, and oftentimes these are areas, if you're talking about the developing world or the global south, these are mostly areas which are called sort of informal settlements, right? But it's not a very specific I mean, it doesn't have a very specific definition. It cannot, because it varies very widely, like from not just like region to region or country to country, but even within a city, so the definition of informality can be very broad. So we'll go through that just a little bit, right? So what is informality, right? So what do you think is informality? You can give me just words or phrases or ideas, whatever you think. Very quick. Yeah.
To me, it's the existence of something that everyone recognizes, but no one has really defined and put a specific meaning to it.
Okay.
It's kind of lacking in the structure, lacking in the formalities.
Very good. So lacking, yeah, go ahead, Radit.
Maybe freedom from taxes, freedom from rules.
So yes, you're all getting to that. So that's a very important point you made. So it is basically, it's the antonym or the opposite of formality. So it's much easier to define what is formality, right? So formality is what pertains to or what follows structure, rules, regulations, order, all of that. However, you also have to understand that those kinds of things, when it comes to planning, rules, regulations, order, structure, I mean, they are necessary. I mean, how do they come about? This is a whole story, right? They're usually made by some people who we think are experts or who have the political power or the skills, whatever. Society deems them to be more expert at doing these, right? So it may or may not actually sometimes be very sensitive. So, for example, most of the structures and systems in place in countries that were former colonies have been borrowed from the colonial times. You see, so in Indonesia, you have a lot of legacy of structures, etc., systems. I mean, the ways of jurisprudence or the legal frameworks, etc., that you inherited from the Dutch colonialists. So in countries like in India, for example, where we are from, we inherited from the British. Others got it. All of Latin America got it from like either Spain or Portugal, for example, right? So anyway, so the point I'm making is that it's not necessarily something which is always very clearly able to sort of address the challenges in today's time at the grassroots, because they were maybe from a different era. That's one. The other one is maybe it is not necessarily, I mean, those structures and laws, and I mean, as much as they are well intentioned, may or may not reflect the contribution of people in informal sort of settings in a way, right? Because they tend to be poor, marginalized, and so on and so forth, right? So anyway, so oftentimes these ideas about formal planning and structures and rules and regulations reflect the sort of understandings, perspectives, preferences, prejudices of the elites in society, of those who are privileged. Get it? So they are usually very highly educated. They mostly come from the upper classes. In countries like India, maybe from upper caste and things like that, right? Dominant ethnic groups, etc. Right? So for example, in Indonesia, for example, a lot of your main governance structures, etc., this was all dominated by people from Java, for example, right? Still, there's a Javanese domination, right? That sort of thing. Anyway, so what I'm trying to explain to you that we must understand that as much as formality is desirable, and we should have things very formal and structured and the rule of law and order and all of this, and even maybe sort of be strict or strict at punishing or censuring or penalizing those who don't, we have to acknowledge the fact that formality or the formal structures are not perfect. In fact, they are quite imperfect. Get it? And they're not able to address the entire sort of range of challenges and demands that society has in a way, right? So this is the trick. So why does informality exist? Is because the capacity of governments and the state, when I say the state, that is the government, right? In developing countries is still limited because they're still emerging from sort of most of them emerging from the colonial past. So they had to remake their structures and everything, right? So because of all of this, the ability, and so the government has various roles to play, right? It has got like whatever, national defense, foreign affairs, industrialization, mining, whatever, like agricultural development, all of the economic sector stuff, social welfare, and then planning and so on and so forth, right? So if you look at the hierarchy of things, traditionally, planning has not held a very high priority, okay, among the different things, because most important is, okay, we need to provide education or health or economic development. So planning is still an emerging, even in the developed countries, planning receives less attention compared to a lot of other sectors, for example, right? But it is improving and the emphasis is increasing because the realization that these are so important to the future and to the present, and that most people will be living in cities, as I showed right previously. So urbanization is a real thing. It'll keep on happening. It'll keep on accelerating in many places. Sooner or later, during this century, most people in the world, almost like the vast majority of them, will live in cities. So we need more and more capacity and talent and ability to deal with planning issues, right? So it is growing. So, but in the meantime, while there is this gap between what is needed and what can be afforded in terms of planning expertise and skills and inputs, you will see informality. Okay, now the mindset so far had been, because it was kind of a colonial legacy, but it was also an elitist perspective in post-colonial situations. It was believed that anything that's informal is bad, and it should be done away with, and everything should be formalized. So the understanding about why informality exists, why informality is not bad, in fact, it can be an asset, has come about because of a lot of interesting research, interdisciplinary, by sociologists, anthropologists, planners, policymakers, geographers, all of that. So our understanding about these marginalized groups and sort of disempowered communities has constantly been improved. And that is now reflecting in sort of the way we advise policymakers and things, right? So it's a very virtuous cycle in a way, right? But it's a slow process. Still, the majority of planners or people who populate the planning institutions, I would say, are not necessarily very sensitive to these things. Okay, and this idea, this dichotomy between the formal and the informal is still very present. Okay, so if you look at a lot of research coming out today, people will say that we don't. So in the past, the idea was, oh, there are slums, we should demolish them. Not acceptable. They're bad, they cause disease, they're violent. It's a poor image of the city. Our country looks bad when foreigners come to visit our city. That remove them, evict them, demolish them. We should put them in houses, like or whatever, in flats. Okay, without understanding that places where they live are not just places of, places where they live, but also places where they work. So if you go to an informal settlement, like you went to Tambaloro, people are working there. Okay, most slums you'll see in that people are. So this is informality, right? So the most sort of common perception that people have about informality pertains to the illegal nature of informality. Okay, the illegality. So most people think that informal sector is all illegal. Right? However, informality can be legal, mostly legal, and yet have some issues, right? But yes, but how can it be illegal? That's the other thing. It can be illegal in terms of where you are, the space. Get it? So in the formal structure, there are only two ways of having access to space, whether it's residential space or your in the modern system, I mean, right? Or the workspace, whatever space you have. It is either you own the space or you rent the space. In traditional societies, neither of this was true. You'll still find a lot of indigenous groups and communities all over the world, including in Indonesia, many of them, where this concept of ownership and sort of renting is not there. It's community owned. So a lot of natural resources like forests, lakes, wetlands, marine resources, these were considered to be collective property, common property resources. So in economics, there is this understanding of this third type also. But in urban areas, because they reflect modern planning and modern ways of looking and developing the city, looking at and developing the city, you don't see as much of the common property. It's something that you see in rural communities, some rural communities, or in the indigenous community. It's common all over the world, right? So that's the thing. So if something is not owned or rented, then it will be deemed informal. Okay? So now there are many words. There are three popular words, for example. They are known by different names. So like if you hear the word kampung in Indonesia, you generally think it's informal, right? So those who are familiar with India, for example, you might have heard the word say joggi chhopdi or basti, for example. In Turkey, there is a word called geke kondu, for example. In Manila, you have tondo, for example, right? Those kinds of things. Yeah. So all of these, in South Africa, you have shanties, townships. Okay, these are all words are different. In Latin America, you have barrios, pueblos. These are all words that, favelas in Brazil. These are all words that mean something informal, right? However, slums, there's a definition for slums, and the UN Habitat, you can look it up, is a very clear definition. It's a combination of things, right? Legal aspects, physical conditions, health-wise, environmental conditions, so on and so forth. So if the majority of these aspects are lacking, then it becomes like a slum. Okay. So even a formal place can be a slum. Get it? So like in the US, for example, most of the places which are called slums, these are poor areas or like residential areas in inner city communities and very disadvantaged neighborhoods. They're not really informal in the sense that they're not illegal. They are formally built. But the maintenance and the upkeep and all of that is so poor that it's very unhealthy for people to live there. It's uninhabitable. And that is why it's deemed a slum, you see. So in the US, people don't use the word slum because they think it's very derogatory. It's like that. It's very interesting. In the rest of the world, the word slum actually is very empowering in many places in the global south. Because at least if you're called a slum, that means you're being recognized, that you exist. Many of the informal settlements don't even formally exist, meaning they're not recorded on official maps and data and censuses because they're considered to be, they're migrants, they've come from outside, they've settled here, so they don't belong here, so we're not even going to measure them or see them, you see. So these are lots of, it's very complicated, this whole business, right? So informality has different dimensions. One is this legal dimension. Legal in terms of how you own it. First, right? That's the most prominent one. So when you hear the word squatter settlements, that's another very common word. Squatter settlements are people who have squatted, meaning they have gone and sat on somebody else's land. They don't have the ownership or the rental rights to that, but they're occupying the place. Occupying. That is squatting, right? That's the most common form of informality, right? And then, of course, they can be slums or they cannot be slums. There are squatters, or squatted land can also belong to the middle class and the upper middle class. In many cities, when your development is illegal, when you really don't have clear title, this is actually quite, if you think of it, it could be quite prominent in cities like Jakarta, where access to land or the acquisition of land is very suspicious and cloudy, and it violates the existing rules and regulations, yet it's, similarly, the second point is if you, in terms of the built form area, if you violate the quote unquote official building standards and planning bylaws and planning guidelines, then it is also informal. Okay. However, we always think of informality with the poor and the marginalized, right? Now, if a developer is building a building which is supposed to be 20 floors high, but he somehow bribes the government officials or something, or whatever, not bribes, who gets permission, which is violating again the existing rules, and he is able to build 22 floors, then that is also informal. But we never call formal like a big, massive luxury house informal. Okay? So the perception, the social perception, common perception about informality always sort of associates with poverty and sort of destitution and things like that. Right, that's the thing. So this is, but what I'm saying is there's very widespread informality in cities, but we don't see the informality there. Anyway, so that's the other point, right? So anyway, so how you own it, how to do this, and then the processes, right? Maybe the processes, you didn't get the right permits, you're still following the rules, for example, right? So I'm not building more, for instance, I'm building a house. Same, it can also be in terms of footprint. Say you were supposed to only occupy 50% of your plot, your lot size, with your structure. The rest is to be open for whatever sustainability reasons. It should be left green, not paved, whatever. But you decide it's okay, I'm going to fudge a little bit. I'm going to go 2 feet this way, 3 feet that way, and eventually I'm occupying 56% instead of 50%. It's actually violating the law. Now the question is, it really doesn't put any major threat to life or property or health. So then does it mean that the formal structure is wrong? So then the formality comes in question. So anyway, so like I said, the formality is also like said, it's not necessarily, especially when it pertains to poorer communities and all, it should not be considered something so sacrosanct and so set in stone that you cannot change it. That's the problem. Because the limitations of poorer people and communities is much more, so they need to adapt, right? So the process I mean is, so let's say I've built a house which is actually conforming to the city standards. I'm using the same materials, same structures, but I did not follow the process. I did not get the necessary permits, and I did not get this and that, just because maybe I did not have the money, I did not have the time to spend in. Time is also money. So a lot of poor people are not able to follow the process. Even violating the process can amount to informality. Get it? So informality is a very, very broad term. The reason I gave you such a long spiel about informality is because informality in Indonesia is very unique. Most informality that you see. So, and maybe most Indonesians don't realize this because they haven't seen it in other places, right? They think it's the same thing, but it's very easy to see from the outside. So, like the kampung you visited, many of the kampung, okay, many kampung, inner city kampung. So, for example, the way you went and did Bati, right? Now, that kampung would be considered to be an informal settlement, but it is not informal in many ways. The lots are very clear. They have title. Many of them will have titles to the land. Many will have the permit to build. The EMB. That one. What is the Asian Mandidikan Mahuna thing, right? That one. They'll be paying water tariffs for the PDIM, the water supply, municipal water supply. They'll be paying electricity. They'll be paying land tax. How is it informal? It's informal because it violates maybe what are the things like the setbacks, heights, density, those kind of things. Why? Because they actually predate the modern planning system. You see, so a lot of kampung in Indonesia, urban kampung, have been there for much longer before the modern planning systems after independence came about. So they tend to grow organic. And many people are, of course, poor in those places. The government did not provide a lot of services for a long time because they were considered to be like not safe, whatever, haphazard, very dense, problematic, right? So that led to even more neglect, right? So they organically built stuff. Right? So anyway, so this is the whole. So informality in Indonesia is interesting because they're not necessarily illegal. So if you see slums in Manila, for example, in the Philippines, they are mostly squatter settlements. There are people who have gone and squatted. Same thing in South Asia, and they are huge. Okay. Manila is actually very interesting. Manila has got lots of pockets of small ones. If you go to Bangkok, sometimes you'll see. Bangkok doesn't have huge slums in the middle of the city, but there are lots of little pockets of slums. These are places like below flyovers, along railway tracks, along the river. So it's not like 30,000 households living there or 10,000 households, but maybe just 20 households. But those are also pockets of. They are both informal settlements and slums because the conditions, the quality of life is so bad. Okay. So anyway, so in the world, This is interesting. Similarly, it's in the informal sector of work. That's the other thing, right? What I told you was about space, occupying land and access to shelter. This was the informality I just talked about. But even when it comes to work, right? Most people in the developing world don't work in the formal sector. Formal sector is where you get an appointment letter. There's a contract. You get a monthly paycheck. Taxes are deducted. You pay taxes. You might get a pension, welfare benefits, all of those things. You are allowed to take leave legally, whatever, 10 days a year, 1 month a year, so many paid leave days, so many casual leave days, sick leave days, all of those. That's formal structure. Okay, that can be anything. You can be in the agricultural sector and still work for that, right? So maybe you are working for one of the big agricultural giants and you operate like a thresher or a harvester for them. But many people are not like that. There are many people who are like casual labor, manual labor. They hired on a day, they paid in cash, nothing, right? So most people are like that. Even self-employed people, right? So self-employed people, for example, your biggest corporations, the owners of those corporations, whatever, let's say Sinarmas, Lipo, right? Indomie, right? They are all self-employed, right? They don't work for anyone else, they build a huge corporation, they're self-employed, right? But they have a structure, they're formal because they are following whatever, they have to comply with the regulations of the land and ensure that they should provide the necessary support and welfare to the employees and so on and so forth, right? But the person, the Kakilima, the Warung in the street is also self-employed, right? But that guy is may or may not, again, in the range, right? So for example, a Kakilima, in some cities might need a permit in some places. Kakilima is the push cart, the smallest vendor that you see, right? In some cities, maybe they don't. You can just build one and go and push, right? So depending on the capacity of the city, Kakilima might be regulated or not regulated. The Warung probably is kind of quasi-formal because you probably own the place or you're renting it from someone officially. The land has a tax, it has a property, the whatever. But what you're doing is maybe because then you're maybe whatever you were selling, right? So in many countries there'll be rules like, okay, you cannot have a kitchen here, you cannot be cooking things here, there's fire here, there's a hazard, you cannot have more than so many people here, it becomes a fire hazard, you cannot have, this is where the parking going to come, so you cannot have more than so many seats. So developed countries have all this kind of craziness, right? There's like a thing for everything, measurement and so many people, so many parking. It makes things very, but there the system is different because most people work in formal systems, get it? So they can live in formal housing, they can live in. Here the problem is most people are informally employed. So they use the space sometimes. So in the back of a warung, they might be living there. It's both a home and a workspace in a company, get it? So they're either selling stuff there or they're making krupuk. They need the space to, you cannot do this in a developed country. In America, you cannot start making fish crackers and sort of drying them on your balcony. For heaven's sake, you cannot even dry your washing your laundry on the balcony because the rules don't allow it. Because it'll reduce the property value of the thing, of the condo. That kind of thing. So there's a lot of disparity among things, right? So here, most people work in the informal sector. So they don't have any protection. If the Kakilima he gets injured, then there is nobody paying, sort of any sort of medical fees for him, or he's not getting any compensation, right? He could buy insurance. Now that's why the government has universal health insurance for the poor, BPJS, right? That one provides, but in many countries you don't have it. Get it? So informal work. So most people work in the informal sector. But again, informality, like I said, is not a very precise definition. It's a spectrum of informality, right? So things could be very informal or less informal, right? But it's a spectrum. Anyway, so this is what you see. So what is showing here is, see, Africa, about more than 3/4 of the people work in the informal sector, right? And then, this is Asia and Pacific, about almost 50% even today. So this Asia and Pacific includes all the developed countries, by the way, yeah. And includes Japan, East Asia, like South Korea, Taiwan, all these countries. Anyway, now, what is interesting is actually, globally, this is the global thing, right? This is the global trend, right? Globally, informality has been actually declining. Okay. However, urbanization has been increasing, right? So urban populations have been increasing. So in absolute numbers, the people living in informal sectors and slums is probably increasing, right? The proportion, however, is being decreasing, right? Informal shelter. This is shelter, housing wise, right? So this is basically telling you the slum population, this black thing. So from 1990, when the global thing was about 50% or 46%, it's come down to about 30%. And that's also because in a lot of countries there has been like lots of economic development, and so they've moved on to like countries like say China, for example, the level of urban informality has gone down. India also has been building a lot of housing for the poor. Even countries like Ethiopia are building a lot of housing. Indonesia is building a lot of housing for the Rusunawa that are being built. Rusunawa is a term for walk-up flats, for the poor. So a lot of people who live in informal settlements and slums, they are being encouraged to move into these walk-up flats. Okay. So for example, here in Samaran, you have the Kaligawe, development, which is a big one, right? Like that. Anyway. So there's a lot of research, don't have time to go into all of that, but so you're focusing on resilience and sustainability, right? So from the resilience and sustainability, particularly the resilience, which is the overall sort of well-being and resilience of a community, of a city, of a society, right? A lot of progressive research and critical research in the last 20 years is indicating this, that poor urban planning and policies are inclusive of, they have to be inclusive on the informal sector, and these are essential for urban resilience and sustainable development. So what does that? So that involves the common needs are legal identity and standing, like I just said. A lot of slums and informal settlements are not even recorded. They don't exist officially in official documents and maps and things like that. So that visibility needs to be afforded to them, right? Second is economic and social rights. Even though you might work in so there are lots of cities and countries that are trying to provide some things like basic things, some welfare benefits, some healthcare benefits, some disability compensation, even though you might be, especially if you're poor and in the informal sector. Because like I said, those things are only afforded in the formal sector, right? Social protection, this is again those same things. So all the welfare benefits and social protection, right, that are there. What if somebody dies, what if somebody has an accident, what if somebody falls sick, right? And especially for women and particularly young people, and also the elderly, and then organization representation. There's the political voice, right? Somebody has to represent. So this is also better in places where you have, in countries and societies where you have a robust civil society. So in Indonesia, your civil society, now I'm using the term civil society. Civil society is all those institutions, all those associations. By institution, I mean formal institutions as well as informal institutions, associations, groups, right? Movements, social movements, all of these things that are not part of the government and they're not part of the private market sector, not part of corporation. Everything else, which people do on their own, like work together, get together for a common cause, for a common interest, those are all civil. So NGOs, community-based organizations, LSN, which is NGOs, like you saw the groups in Tambaloro, the women's group that is doing urban farming. Those are all like civil society groups in a way, right? All these things. Okay, so that is also very important. So cities need to encourage those kind of things so that their representation can be stronger of the poor and that their interests can be heard and all. So anyway, so specific things. This is from a. If you are interested to learn about informality, then there's this think tank called the World Resources Institute, which is also it's based in Washington D.C., but it has offices in the developing world, and the WRI, World Resources Institute, Indonesia chapter is quite strong now. The Jakarta, it's based in Jakarta, right? And so some of the things they've been focusing like home-based workers, street vendors, waste process. Most of the waste management in cities in the developing world is actually done by the informal sector. It's not like in the rich countries where you have like a dumpster, you put it outside your house and the truck comes, makes a lot of noise in the morning, picks it up, throws it back. It's not like that. Actually, it is from house to house that scavengers go, or they call rag pickers, scavengers by different names, everywhere. And interestingly, in many cities, their ability to reprocess and then process waste, recycle,
the efficiency is way higher than the best cities that do it in the rich countries. So in some cities like Mumbai, for example, the waste pickers would recycle over 94% of the waste and separate. There's a whole industry on recycling, which is based on like manual scavenging and processing and sorting. Today, a lot of this, unfortunately, in terms of electronic waste is happening in Africa, right? Places like Ghana. They used to be before in places like Bangladesh and China and India, but their environmental regulations have become stronger. So the e-waste, so you think a little carefully about using it when we just use and throw phones and things, it's very toxic and very dangerous. But all of that goes to places which are like very far from our imagination, but it wreaks a lot of havoc out there. Anyway, so far, the point is formal planning always even 20 years ago, 10 years ago, even today you find many plans who think that no, all of this is very messy, very chaotic, informal sector, we must formalize them. So the idea is so it's not like it's like transforming informality into formality. But yes, that could be a slow process and organic process and incremental process, slowly, not all at once. It doesn't work. Until then, you have to learn to work with informality by embracing informality and realizing the potentials and the assets, right? Anyway, so having given you this whole speed, so one of the cities in Indonesia where I work, actually do most of my research is Surabaya, is a very good example of how they have incorporated informality, especially in terms of the shelter sector. And by extension, some of the informal work sector. They also have limitations as well, but in this particular field have done very well. They're like one of the pioneers, I would say, in the world, and also like one of the best practices, right? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how that works over there, right? So most of the presentation is from this book. You'll probably have access. You'll have access to this presentation. So this is a chapter in this book where I was talking about that participatory design. There's a lot of thing you hear about participatory planning, but participatory design is also very important. This is because when it comes to people's homes and things like that. Anyway, so just very quick background. You know all this. The urbanization is happening very fast. Planning capacity is not very adequate in developing countries, right? Now, about 50 years plus in the 1960s, a person called John Turner wrote a book called Housing by People, right? And housing as a model, he coined these phrases also. You studying informal settlements in Latin America back then, right? Like especially in Peru. And he found that when the government tries to make housing for the poor people, it messes things up majorly. Whereas informal settlements and squatter settlements that had been left alone over time really became very nice and hospitable places to live in, right? And this was done completely with the people's own resources, their own energies, but it takes time because they're poor people if you don't have them. So it's an incremental process, right? So he advocated, and he wrote these books that they were very influential and they guided international policy since then, right? Saying that we should not destroy informal settlement slums, but we should think of ways to improve that. Now, inspired by Turner, this is what one of the pioneers in Surabaya, this professor, an architect, planner called Johan Silas did since the 1960s, which I'll tell you the story, right? The other person in the US was this lady called Sherry Arnstein. So Arnstein said that community participation is very important in planning. So even back in those days, in the US, there was this concept of community participation. But she felt that the community participation in most places was very superficial or very tokenistic, actually. It's just lip service. It was not meaningful. So she came up with this concept called the ladder of participation. It's a conceptual idea. She said, the highest ladder is the one that is the highest rung of the ladder is the one that's most empowering, where communities should be able to make decisions and actually do things and plan on their own. What mostly happens is the lowest rung, which is just like informing the communities, hey, we're going to do this kind of thing. Right. So anyway, that's a concept. So what I'm saying is that both these things have been around for a long time, but they still they haven't really transformed the practice of planning enough, right? Anyway, but they did influence these ideas in the global south. Self-help is the Turner's idea that people can help themselves if they are given the space and the support and the resource, right? Incremental development. Things can get better and much better, but In the informal sector with poor people, it takes time, slowly. You cannot expect things to just change in 1 year. Give them 5 years, 10 years, things will improve, right? That kind of thing. And participation. If you are making by shelter, I mean all kinds of things, right? Building flats, homes, improving infrastructure in communities, all of these things, right? In residential communities. So people's participation is very important. If you involve communities, you will do well, will make the results much better, outcomes will be much better. If you don't, then doesn't matter how well intentioned you are, how well meaning you are, your outcome will never be good, right? That's the thing, right? So some of the things in the shelter thing is called in situ slum upgrading, right? So this in situ slum upgrading is the idea. In situ means on site. So if you have slums, etc., even if they are squatters on somebody else's land, the wisdom suggests that cities should try to keep them there and improve them, improve it. Of course, in some cases it's not possible if they are very, say, in very risky areas, right? So let's say in places which are low lying, you can face storm surges or something, or on top of a hill, it can be prone to landslides in the path of a volcanic sort of flow, those kind of things. But other than that, as long as possible, keep them where they are, right? And this was pioneered in Surabaya, right? This one. So, and the other ideas is results take time, incrementally is the mantra, and we also need mass housing because not everybody can only live in kampung. That's the other truth, right? As societies develop, as cities develop, economic systems change, many people will move from those primary sector production industries to actually say working in factories, etc. It's, I mean, it is one of the sort of features of urbanization and development, right? You know, the manufacturing. That is what the industrial development was, which transformed cities of the West in a way, right? So that's what's transformed China. That's what's transformed a lot of the developing countries. So eventually, so if people start working in factories, etc., they are kind of now in the formal sector. So now they don't need work, live in workspaces like you have in traditional kampung or informal settlements. They could now move into flats, etc. Also, as people's incomes change, they will also work. So as people move from the lower income to the middle income bracket, then their lives become more like other sort of professional urban people, right? And so they can then, for them, it's better to live in apartments, etc., convenience, all of this thing, because they work regular jobs, you know, and they want the services, etc., right? So we have to understand that different people in society have different needs, right? Anyway, so that is also important. The importance to provide affordable housing on a mass scale, right? And so I will. So the objective in Surabaya, Indonesia, this is the thing. So participatory design and planning and incrementalism over 50 years has led to very good outcome. That's what I argue in this paper and the thing. And then the city university collaboration was very important. So your university, our university UH works a lot with actually different community groups and different local institutions, and that is actually very essential. However, this is not very common in places around the world, right? And the third thing is this innovation and flexibility is very important. Just because you have some rules and regulations and models in place, it doesn't mean that you should not revisit them. You should constantly reevaluate their relevance, their utility, their effectiveness, you know, and if needed, have provisions in your system to be flexible and alter them as needed. This is very, very important, but this is quite rare in real life, right? And then, of course, if you have what I mean in planning here is that design is very important to the outcome of people's life, right? But over time, what has happened is in the affordable housing business, right? Today, so whatever the affordable housing, informal housing sector, okay, these things are very important. Affordability is most important, right? If you can make a house for cheaper, I mean, whatever plan or house for, I mean, the cheapest price tag is the best, you know, right? Legality. If you can give them legal rights, great. And then, of course, there's some participation also. This participation is like when you come to about informal settlements about where can you build things and all of those things, you know, like getting the people to participate, to agree to say demolishing some of the existing structures so that you can widen roads and, you know, improve. So a lot of the slum upgrading or urban upgrading kind of informal settlement upgrading processes involve demolition and reconstruction, and so participation is useful in them, community mapping, those kind of things. However, over time, my argument is, especially in Surabaya, that these things have not been given much prominence. Design and livability. But this is not just in Surabaya everywhere. So my argument is that it should be like this. If you balance these things out, design and livability are equally important, and that makes shelter for the poor the best in a way, right? Anyone, So there are some examples, right? So in India, for example, there was this very famous project done in the late 80s and early 90s called Aranya Housing, okay, in a city called Indore. So this was where there were these slum dwellers who were moved from the city just to the edge, and they were given, it was a huge plot, resettlement project. So the poor people were given plots. But at the same time, the planning and design was done by this firm called B.V. Doshi Vastushil. This is the name of the architect, B.V. Doshi. So he's one of the world's most famous architects. He's a recipient of what's called the Pritzker Prize. The Pritzker is like a Nobel Prize for architecture, the highest, sort of accolade you can receive in the field of architecture. So they were very much involved in the planning. And also what they realized the fact that poor people's lives are not, frozen, right? That they evolve. The families will evolve, needs will evolve. Hopefully the economic, conditions will improve. So they will need to expand into the house, right? So they designed these lots and they made these prototypical design, a lot of them. As you can see, this one is only this much, then over time we do this. But they gave some guidance. So it's a very good design, very high quality designers, understanding the need of the poor people and providing ideas for how people could expand and this thing, right? So this was very good. So incremental and flexible and over time, right? Similarly, another very famous architect from India called Charles Correa, okay, he also did this. So there's an area called, EB might have been there, this is Navi Mumbai, New Bombay, right? So when New Bombay was being built as a spillover sort of a city for Mumbai, Mumbai is big, India's biggest commercial metropolis, right? So as it was expanding, so to the south of Mumbai, they created a new city called Navi Mumbai, which is connected by public transit and transit-oriented development, all these kinds of things. Also made housing, right? So they acknowledge the fact that there will be people, poor people coming in. Most of the people will come from villages, right? And in that state, or which is in Western India called Maharashtra. So people from Western India more likely to come to this place. So villages, people who are in villages, they tend to, in those parts of India, have these houses which are courtyards. Okay. So a lot of these new migrants to the city, because they will attract, jobs will attract them, the informal sector will attract them, right? So this was a housing project for them, where they thought that over time they can improve it, but the initial houses were designed by Charles Correa in a way that, it reflects the traditional rural living, and the community living in the space and the houses facing each other around the courtyard. And then gradually people can expand. So these are all examples of how possibly they will expand, right? Anyway, so this is what it looks like today, for example. Most of these areas, this was a low income housing, and now it's become pretty much middle and even upper middle income housing, right? These people's lives themselves have improved. Some other people have moved in, right? So, but as you can see, you can still see, this is the original sort of thing, right? But now people have expanded, built. So a lot of times planners and architects think that this is not a good thing. But in many ways, if another way of looking, it's a very good thing. People understand their needs the best. So if you can give them some aid, of course, they should not be just creating some haphazard, risky stuff like that. But if you can give them some guidance, and if people can follow some basic principles, then it's a good thing actually. Yes.
Quick question about this project, this project, for example. Oh, yeah, sure. About this project in particular, since it was, I presume, created with partnership with Livability and Charles Correa, were the settlements themselves informal, or was each, sorry, let me rephrase that. Was each settlement a legal entity, even though it might have been settled informally?
Yeah. So maybe this was a little different. This was anticipating what's going to happen. So they were already informal settlements.
Okay.
So there were some studies done to see who these people, so they realized who are the likely people to move to this place, right? And there might be new migrants and there might be existing sort of squatters in that part of Mumbai who probably will go there, right? So of course there's a process to identify. So this was to provide housing for them, right? So they knew who the client group was going to be, and so designed it in accordance. So what I'm saying is there's a lot of the, so what is the point I'm trying to emphasize? The point I'm trying to emphasize is that there's a lot of attention paid to designing the environments in a way, which doesn't happen. So if you look at your most of your national housing plans today, the Rusunawa plan, I'll show you, is the same standard floor plan that gets replicated everywhere in Indonesia, right? It's not just Indonesia, every country does it like that, right? Whereas when you pay attention to design, it creates for better outcomes. This is another excellent example from Chile, right? This is by this group called Elemental, okay, and the architect who's the boss of Elemental, his name is Alejandro Aravena. He's also a Pritzker Prize winner. Okay, so there was a massive earthquake in Chile, after which they had a lot of these poor people had to be they were displaced and they had to be rehabilitated. So in this case, Aravena literally made like half a house, right? So this is the house for one particular household. Okay, so the basic things, so some of the most expensive parts of a house are the concrete foundations, the concrete floor slabs, and if you have a concrete roof. So the slabs and the foundations are the most expensive part because they have a lot of steel and concrete and all of that, right? Walls and all you can adjust and you can make with makeshift materials and temporary materials and all of that. So he literally built it like this. He provided the basic shell with the basic structure and expected people to, expand as and when needed. So this part was left empty. So when people have it, as you can see, some have already built, some have not built, right? So when the family has the capacity, then they'll design it as they want it, right? They of course had a lot of examples also like the other one. They provided prototypes. If you want, you can do this design, that design, anyways. This is in Bangkok. So Bangkok has a lot of these slums, okay, and Bangkok has this national program called Ban Mangkok, which is basically working with water settlements to rehabilitate slums. So this is in situ in many cases. They don't try to move them. Wherever they are, can you improve? But the process involves working with local NGOs, a lot of local volunteers from NGOs and universities, as well as professional sort of architects, right? Those things have been going on. So with each community, this work together. There's also a component of financing. So they use microfinancing, small loans, etc., which is managed by the community, so that people can borrow from that and also have some contribution towards the cost of the house. If you pay some money towards that as an individual or a household, you have a greater stake in ensuring that it is successful and in maintaining that. So there are all these principles. So basically very collaborative, involving multiple universities and professionals and NGOs, right? They pay a lot of emphasis on community participation in mapping, planning, and designing the environments for, right? This one. Also, the very interesting, this is in Kampung Tongtol in Jakarta, just north of Kota. Okay, so this is an example, small project, this one. So this is got like 2 households over here, but they made it into like 4 units. This is made with, this is the back side, this is the front side, right, on the river. This is one of the poorest communities in Jakarta, right, in slum areas, whatever you call them, informal settlements. But this was done with very affordable brick and bamboo and all this, right? So this was done by this group, Architecture Sans Frontières Indonesia. This is Architects Without Borders, the Indonesia chapter. So this was designed by one of the founders of this chapter, right? And so this was a great demonstration project, but unfortunately it hasn't scaled up. So the point here is that you can do good design to provide very affordable solutions using local materials and natural materials, but that's not the standard procedure for how planning works, right? So they also showed all these things, how they did the whole project, and they have made these drawings and these ideas publicly accessible for free, right? These kind of things. Anyway, so what did I'll go very quickly. So what did Surabaya do? Surabaya mostly did not build any housing. So in 1969, the person Johan Sidas told the mayor, look, we should not demolish our slums. We should, or whatever, informal said the campo. We should keep the campo, provide only community level infrastructure, roads. What are the problems? Flooding, stormwater drainage, solid waste management, toilets, because at that time, open defecation was a problem There were not enough toilets, no sewage system, so they made community toilets, MCK, right? So MCK is like a acronym for toilets and like washing and bathing spaces in Indonesia. So they MCK. So they made MCKs in the city, in the kampung, right? And so just these, so roads, sanitation, meaning MCK, stormwater drainage, and solid waste management. Over time, they started adding other things, like say, water supply, electricity, and then gradually other things like social and health things, public health, public education, especially for women, you know. So once PKK started, you know, like this is the family planning program in Indonesia, they, those things were dovetailed, integrated with the company. They continued this process. So they said, we're not going to, and they will not evict anyone, not move anyone, improve that. However, the interesting thing is they did not dedicate even $1 or 1 cent to housing. They did not build housing. People improve their housing on their own. This is almost like translating that Turner's vision. If you leave it to their own, they'll figure it out, right? But they provided things which at the community level which are important, right? And they continued this process for a good 40, until decentralization and, you know, like the fall of Suharto and democratization in the late 1990s, right? So about 30 years plus, 35 years, they did this unbroken. And then it became very popular. It was supported by the World Bank, the UN, all kinds of bilateral agencies, and it became a model for other countries also. The initial thing was that the other important thing was that Johan Silas and his team did not just draw these plans. They actually engaged with each community, explained the benefits of this. They came forward, they trained them, they worked with them. They also constantly evaluated what was happening to look at the before, after, before, after. So a very meticulous sort of research and this thing, but all the planning and this, so they did not build houses, but the community level designing and planning, the landscaping, all of this was done involving the communities. So it was a very, so this empowered communities in Surabaya, right? So today, if you go to Surabaya and you want to do some project, it's so easy because every community knows all of this. They know what is participatory planning design. You don't have to explain things to them. They will in fact tell you lots of things. So this is, but it's taken that it's incremental, takes a long time, right? Okay. Now the other idea is, so is Rusunao. So then after decentralization, under the mayor, Risma, so this was Indonesia's first mayor who was a woman mayor, and she was very sort of celebrated. People loved her, and she was very strong, you know, anti-corruption, very clean, very. And she was also a student of Johan Silas. So she had actually worked on some Rusunawa project very early on. So before that, before Risma became the mayor, there were very few Rusunawa projects. When Risma came to power, she realized that things are changing. There are lots of migrants moving in. We need to make more housing. So now we need to provide more housing. So let us do some Rusunawa projects. Okay. So there were about 3 or 4 Rusunawa walk-up flats projects in Surabaya in the 80s and the 90s. And the early ones also involved Johan Silas' team in the university, which worked with communities. And it made for really good results, right? So these are some pictures of what the early kampung improvement projects looked like, right? This was all done with community self-help. Okay. So this is like your Karja Bhakti, you know, Gautam Royong, okay, you know, Tolong Menolong, all of these, Mushawara, all of these processes that are there, right? So this is like building roads. So, you know, so this is people actually doing this. So what these were some early, so one of the biggest changes you see is solid waste management. They have these receptacles for, I was telling you, okay, this is the rubber one, right? It's the original idea of using old tires, etc., for receptacles. Now it's changed people's behavior and perceptions, and I mean, sort of acts quite a bit, right? Then later ones also started using economic development principles. These are, so in the so after decentralization, the newer KIT programs, there are very few, not too many, because by then they had almost done all the kampungs that they improved in Surabaya. But they still wanted to revitalize some of them with economic development. So they started microfinance, which was managed by communities. Now, why microfinance by communities? Because microfinance, which is small loans, microfinance, you might have heard the word, right? Microfinance is small amounts of money given for short periods of time with high rates of interest. This was an innovation done in Bangladesh in modern times. Okay, the person who did that won the Nobel Prize for Peace, Mohammed Yusuf. He was a professor of economics back in the US and he moved back. This idea spread a lot. However, some forms of microfinance have always been traditional. Like in Indonesia, you have arisan, which is a revolving savings and credit group, right? That kind of thing. In other countries, you also have that. But this is more formal in a way, structured. So microfinance lets people take small loans for small things. So the formal microfinance sector is very big in India. Banks, what banks do. In fact, it's the oldest in the world. The first microfinance institution in Indonesia was set up, like the bank was set up in the 19th century. But they give loans, slightly bigger loans, not very small ones, and they give mostly and only for like business purposes. If you have a personal emergency, for example, it's very difficult to go and get it from the bank. Get it? A personal loan, personal microfinance. So if you want to suddenly pay fees for your children or something, or your, like somebody had an accident, has to be in the hospital. So if you're a poor family, you don't have access to that kind of money, suddenly that you cannot get from a bank. You only get it for that, So it's very structured, right? So community-based microfinance thought, the idea was to overcome some of these limitations and let communities manage it themselves. So run by people elected by the community, appointed by the community, and done on their own terms. They figure out what is the rates of interest, what is the penalty. All these things were given to them. So anyway, so this is also, they also added some microfinance components to that, right? So anyway, so this is by Johan Silas, and this is at ITS, the Institute of Sepulu November Institute of Technology, the Institute of Technology in Surabaya, right? This was his team. So these are some of the highlights. Like he led a team of many students were involved, right, in this process because they used to use this is the university and city working together, one kampung after another, one kelurahan after another, year after year, right? It went on and on. So the great thing was that a lot of the students who graduated to become planners also had the philosophy in mind, right? So the city government, the city planners of Surabaya generally also sort of embrace that whole philosophy and continue the philosophy on their own, right? And so, like I said, so they gave a lot of autonomy to design to the communities, and the generations were trained, and this became a transformative approach, right? So this started with the KIP. So the KIP had created these kampung, and so you go to kampung, even like the ones you saw, there are many in Samarang also, but ones in Surabaya, many of them are very interesting because the public space, this is the lane or the gang. So this becomes like a community space, like private space spilling over into the private space spilling over, public space into the private space, all kinds of things. People, talk, work together, celebrate. You can like close off a gun to have a wedding, a funeral, all these kinds of things, and everybody participates, right? Okay, so this is like one of my reasons. This is a picture, this is one of my favorite pictures I took some years ago. So this is a small lady who runs a shop here, and we go with some microfinance loan, and the space outside has become a public space. You know what time this picture was taken? It's in midnight. So it's so alive. So some of you read Jane Jacobs, Eyes on the Street, and all the concept, right? How cities are, streets are safe, cities are safe. Your kampung are epitomes of are the epitome of that sort of eyes on the street and that concept anyway. So, but later on they started making these Rusunawa, right? So the first Rusunawa, this was this was built around the mid 1990s. This was designed by the team from ITS, under Pasilas's guidance. Not just Pasilas directly, but then now he had other senior sort of architects and lecturers working, right? But the thing was, because they had worked so much on, and they were so pro kampung, and then realized they knew the value of kampung life and all the sort of characteristics of the built form. They wanted to sort of recreate some of that in even the public housing project. Right? This was their aim. So their design involvement led to this, right? So as you can see, this is also there, like somebody has a cycle, motorcycle, a bench here, right? And so, like you see on the kampung, this kind of thing is possible. Why? Because these corridors were made so wide, like 8 feet wide, right? If you go to Kaligaw or Samarang, it's barely 1 meter, 3 feet. So you cannot do any of that, right? But then also the designs were sometimes they're like these niches, alcoves, which can create these kind of things, right? They also made space for the kaki lima and all, because even the people who live there need some access to quick food and all, right? So this was one of the first projects actually which accommodated kaki lima. Now it's a standard thing in Indonesian housing design when you have to rusunawa. But at the time it was not. They just made houses in the flats. So they incorporated spaces for commercial development. But again, there are limitations. These are not necessarily very bustling. Yeah, Ibi.
I have a quick question
Yeah.
about the corridors. Is that only on the ground floors?
No, every floor.
So every floor would have kaki lima?
No. So this the kaki lima. Kaki lima is on the ground floor.
Okay, okay.
No, but interestingly, in some places they are on other floors. So one newer project some years ago in Jatinagara in Jakarta tried to incorporate, because see now it's been standardized, codified. There you have to provide space for kaki lima and some warrants, right? Because I mean this was a model or whatever, best practice. But then when you start doing it in a formulaic way, it becomes problematic. So because they had to include it, where they include it on the fourth floor or something.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, like.
So nobody goes to the fourth floor and the boys. So
Like how? Like how would
Yeah,
it even go
yeah.
up?
So no, here is only on the ground floor, right? That kind of thing, right? So then this is another very interesting program. So this was a community which is mostly from Madura. So Madura is this small island of Surabaya. There's a lot of prejudice against people from Madura. Okay, they think like Maduranis commit whatever, like petty crimes and things like that. They're cheaters, whatever. I mean, so they don't have it's just a prejudice, like you can't help it, it's there. Anyway, but they were very poor people, so their settlement was destroyed in a fire, so they had to be resettled. This was done again in the 90s, So in this case, they made design things like like these kind of things. These are spaces to keep your wares. So a lot of them are like petty sort of traders, vendors, right? So they have to keep their equipment somewhere, right? All of this thing. So they made spaces like this, where they could keep these things. Then inside, this is more interesting. They told the team that we live as a community. So their community had a trend of cooking together, community cooking and community washing, right? So they wanted kitchens and things outside. So what they did was they designed these kind of spaces. See, this is like cooking areas. These are common washing areas. So and this is on an upper floor. This is not on the first floor. So between say 3 or 4 units, suddenly you come out to an open space which is like this, right? And as you can see, this is being cooked. This is all nasi here. See, so interestingly, today people's habits have changed a little bit, but in the old days it was a little different. And then more recently they have added in these kinds of spaces also. But this is like with a big sort of a net and also little exclusive. Now the interesting thing was, look at this. So this is inside. This is the upper floors of a building. So one day I went there. Outside there's nothing happening. I went inside. There's a wedding that is taking place. This is a wedding. This is a wedding on the top 2 floors. So this is the musola. On every floor is a musola prayer room, right? This is the stage where the bride and the groom are sitting. These are all tables that have been laid out for people. So of course, I mean, the party was yet to come, but everything. So the entire party for some 100-some people, the wedding party is happening in the buildings. Because in a kampung, this is what would happen. You close off a street and that's where these events will take place. But they were able, because they created such spaces, I mean, wide spaces and in consultation with the communities, they were able to incorporate these kinds of activities, which you don't see, right? So anyway, so this is a later project, also involved the ETS, but this one allowed less sort of flexibility. Over time, what has happened, the government has allowed less and less flexibility. They have changed the standards, made the unit plans smaller and smaller, allowing less space for, they have standardized these things, formalized the design of Rusunawa. These early projects, there was no national code for Rusunawa, whatever, or standards. Now there are. Get it? So anyway, so this one doesn't have any doubly loaded corridor. It only has a single, meaning there are rooms only on one side, not on this side. But still, there was some semblance of people keeping their chairs outside to the top, especially old people. They like to do this, right? And kids, they play there. So it's like a public space, even though it's a housing thing, which you don't see in other countries at all. Right? It's very unique here. So anyway, so this is just a quote, but it was not easy. This is just showing like how much engagement the people from the university research department had to do with the people, the communities, in order to assure them that this was I mean, they'll work with them, it's in their interest and all, to gain their trust, basically, right? So they were also like trying to be violent sometimes, people came chasing them with sticks and stones and knives, things like that, but it persisted. Then the whole community consultation process and to get them onto the planning, sort of on the drawing board and all, took about 3 months. So patient process, right? This is what it looks like, what a common new national government built sort of Rusunawa, I mean, Walker flat looks like. These are all these tiny apartments. See, this is the standard thing. Standard floor plan, unit plan. Some cases, this is a tiny, this is like 1 meter by 1.2 meters, 1.3 meters. So you can like go from here, here, here. Okay, in the name. Some places you might have balcony, some don't even have a balcony in many of these things, right? This is what it looks like inside, right? This is the thing. So that's the balcony behind, right? This one. So this lady lives with like 5 other members in this time. So very crowded, right? And there's also increasingly no more space outside. So now this lady is selling this, but actually these are newer rules now. There it is outlawed. You're not supposed to be selling things and have stores. Okay, because they have designated like some spaces outside or on the ground floor, right? So that organic nature of social interaction is being sort of completely hampered, right, by these kind of rules and regulations. So she still has it, but it's kind of illegal. Same way, this is there because they say like basic thing, the Indomie has to be sold, you know, like your coffee, whatever, right? But this is inside the house. You know, but this is also kind of they're tolerating it, but it is actually not allowed. So anyway, these are some of the latest ones. So you can see how, I mean, this is just from the looks of it, how sterile they look, you know, there's nothing around, you know, those kind of things. So anyway, so the basic point is that, you know, that most of the attention when it comes to affordable housing and housing policy today in the world is about making things cheap, affordable. But just making it cheap and affordable is very problematic because for poor people, especially those who are in the informal shelter sector, and then you can move them into these kinds of more, better formalized housing structures. You have to acknowledge the fact that for them, it's work and life and entertainment, all of those places put together. You know, there's something about livability. You know, is it livable? Do you enjoy it? Does it stimulate you? Does it serve your needs? For that, you need good design. But unfortunately, there's no. So the design changes that you see basically when you see these kind of the Rusunawa, the walk-up flats being built in different parts of Indonesia. Only things they change are the roof structure. So maybe the Sulawesi one will have a different roof structure, and the elevation, the walls might look a little different. Inside is the same story. And again, now so you will, like I said, it's so narrow nowadays. You cannot, if you keep in most of these, you cannot even keep a chair outside because then people can't walk, right? So this kind of thing. So the answer is that participatory. So anyway, so if you do this, it addresses a lot of sustainable development goals, different water, work and livelihoods, education, energy, food, nutrition. Anyway, participatory, inclusive, flexible design with the poor yields more livable and productive environments, even in the Rusunawa plans, not just in the Nampong. So you can do this better. Design creativity, realize the wisdom of in situ upgrading. You can, all that wisdom over 30, 40 years of what improves poor people's communities and lives, you can actually do that even in flats kind of housing, right? But you have to think outside the box. And that requires, now the thing is, public agencies and public housing agencies will not have the time to do it because they are already overworked, they have very few people, resources limited, capacity limited. So this is where collaboration among universities and other sort of local design sort of volunteers, firms, as well as NGOs, etc., provides the answer to do things better, right? And these also we need to appreciate, and these slow transformative impacts need to be studied. So when you do things like your master's thesis or something, or your undergraduate thesis, you should pay attention to these kinds of things and see if you notice these kind of things and then include them, right? Yeah. So anyway, so the last point is here that centralized funding is useful, but design ought to be decentralized. Funding and all should come from the national government that yes, we're supporting these kind of things. But how to do this and the design of all that should be very decentralized, very localized thing, right? And it has to be done in a participatory manner in patient engagement, right? The other thing is relaxed planning laws. This is the formality, informality dichotomy. The formal structure regulation can be very restrictive. So we need to relax these, especially when we deal with poor communities and informal. You see, we cannot just apply the same things, same sort of standards and rules and regulations that we apply for like higher income housing or middle income housing to the poorest places. And again, local universities, civil society organizations, communities, architects, they can all play a role at the local level in order to make shelter and housing better for the poor, right? And again, most important, don't expect things to just be dramatically different in 1, 2, or 3 years. Allow it 5 to 10 years or more. You will see the difference definitely gets visible, right? Anyway, sorry for taking a little longer. Thank you. Last time for you, so I shouldn't keep you waiting. Any last questions or clarifications? Yeah.
You mentioned in the previous. You mentioned in your previous presentation in conjunction with this one that how do they don't take into account the poor. Last presentation you mentioned they just it's just not there because it's not cost effective because everyone's trying to turn a profit. So my question is
private sector.
the private sector is. So my question is what are the biggest hurdles to changing this within planning that you've seen? Like the new capital, even, you said we don't have a plan for that. Is it have to do with these kind of old mentalities of the ruling castes and the lower castes are not considered? Like it's just kind of like they're viewed as a problem or something.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's a yeah. So it's a legacy of the past, So generally, planning has been very top down, sort of non-inclusive, fallacy that the experts know best, So this is expertise driven, that kind of hubris is there. Misunderstanding, misconception about poor communities and informal communities, right? So, like I said, a lot of research is disabusing that. Much of that comes from other social sciences fields. So that also needs to be incorporated into planning. Okay. So like say in the US now, you see a lot of that happening into your introductory history and theory courses do incorporate a lot of, I mean, wisdom from other fields, very interdisciplinary in that sense. That is yet to happen in a lot of the developing countries, I think, so that sort of crossover, cross fertilization of ideas is still not sufficient in my opinion. It's still very technocratic and technical in a way. But things are changing. So what I'm saying is these are very earnest attempts, so I'm not criticizing the intent here. I'm just criticizing the outcome and I'm showing where the problem, I'm arguing where the problem lies. So just throwing money or just having the technical expertise is not enough. You have to be patient, engaged, and it has to be collaborative, participatory. Only then can you make it better. And you can do so. It doesn't necessarily involve a lot more money. Okay. What it does require is a little more time and patience, right? And you can do it better. Participation, But again, how do you make people participate? That's a different story, right? So that is where you need to work with other partners because a lot of mistrust exists between poor communities and governments. In order to overcome that, you have to incorporate and use the services of local NGOs and civil society organizations because they are trusted, especially those who work with poor communities, they are trusted. So they can serve as the go between the intermediaries in order to build the bridges between the sort of institutions that have the power and the capacity and the poor communities in a way. So this is all very well meaning. So this is none of this is private sector. I'm just talking about public sector efforts. These are government efforts. Okay. But they're just trying to increase the numbers and build them as fast as they can, and just move people into these very sterile kind of housing environments, which do not support the current sort of livelihoods and aspirations and needs of these communities in a way, right? That's what. And what I'm trying to argue is that no, you can do it better. And there are examples in your own country. I mean, where this can be done much better in a way, right? So that's it. And again, this applies not just to Indonesia, but everywhere else. But in Indonesia, it's particularly easier as you visited and you've seen, there's a very strong sense of community. You know, like you saw in Tamaloro, I mean, you know, it's a fairly, I mean, it's a community with a lot of challenges, right? I mean, it's by no means a very, I mean, flourishing community, but the spirit and the community solidarity and the willingness to work together, I mean, is very strong. It is better than most other, I think, places in the developing world, I would say. You know, so it's a, I mean, that's an asset that Indonesia has, I think, which can be leveraged. Okay. All right. I think we should. Any other last comment questions? No. Must be hungry. No. All right. Thank you.
Kampung Pelangi.
So this was a really bad situation, and that's.
Yeah, maybe you.
That seems like.
Yeah. The decision was more theirs in terms of the sites. Maybe it's something, no, but it's something that you would think that they're running through this spatial transformation. The whole year. Yeah. But that one.